Good evening and welcome to the main lecture of the second day of Copernicus Festival 2023. My name is Jędrzej Grodniewicz and it's my great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Professor Arie Kruglanski. Professor Kruglanski is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on topics such as uncertainty, closed-mindedness, cognitive closure, violent extremism, political activism, and others. He's an author of hundreds of scientific articles, some of which has been cited thousands of times. This is a huge scientific impact. He's an author of several books, including The Psychology of Close-Mindedness, The Three Pillars of Radicalization, and the most recent one that's related to the topic of today's lecture and presentation, Uncertainty, How to Turn Your Biggest Fear into Your Greatest Power. Join me in welcoming Professor Kruglanski. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo, Jędrzeju. Dobry wieczór dla wszystkich. To jest dla mnie wielki zaszczyt i honor móc odnieść ten wykład o niepewności na festiwalu Kopernika. Niestety mój polski jest trochę zardzewiały i dlatego będę musiał się przenieść na angielski. So again, I'm very honored to speak at this important event in honor of Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, probably the first well-known, world-renowned Polish scientist. As an astronomer, rather than as a psychologist, Copernik wasn't particularly interested in people's feelings, I think, nor was he interested particularly in feelings of uncertainty, although his work, the heliocentric view of cosmology that he promoted and that ran against the geocentric view that was prevalent at the time, probably introduced a lot of uncertainty in the minds and hearts of scientists and theologians of the day. And the way they responded is escape the uncertainty by banning his book. But why did they feel the need to escape the uncertainty? Why was the uncertainty so unpleasant, so unbearable to them? This is what I hope to discuss with you today. How do people feel about uncertainty? We can ask this question of ourselves because recently all of us experienced very acute uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly it changed everything. Our life routines were shattered. We were sheltering at home, avoiding social contact, wearing masks, and observing restrictions that seriously narrowed our lives. If you were lucky, you carried out your work from home. If you are less lucky, you may have been evicted from your home, you may have lost your job, you may have lost your close ones, and all in the shadow of a very dangerous disease that was killing millions. And it's not surprising, therefore, that in reaction to this uncertainty caused by COVID-19, people experienced a lot of distress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of angst. The World Health Organization in 2020 reported 35% increase in distress in China, 60% in Iran, 45% in the United States, and 300% in Ethiopia for some reason. Now, of course, you didn't need the pandemic to know that people's reaction to uncertainty can be very negative, that people can fear uncertainty. People may want to be troubled by uncertainty. It is unknown that we fear when we look upon death and darkness, nothing more, said Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry in the Harry Potter legend. We fear that which we cannot see, said Taite Kubo, the Japanese manga artist. The author Lovecraft said, the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And the psychologist Carlton said, fear of the unknown is possibly the fundamental fear. And scientific psychology did not disagree. Scientific psychology echoed that idea. So, for example, the 1948 by Elsa Frankel-Brunswick introduced the concept of intolerance of ambiguity. Over 50 years later, the Dutch psychologist Geert Hofstede talked about uncertainty avoidance as a construct. There were several theories of self-uncertainty. How do you feel when you feel uncertain about yourself? And again, the idea was that you feel bad and you want to defend yourself against uncertainty about yourself. Very famous work by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, who received the Nobel Prize in economics for his work, talked about escaping uncertainty by using simple rules of thumb. Rather than processing information systematically and extensively, you just use rules of thumb, all in order to escape the uncertainty. And Wendell Gardner, very important cognitive psychologist, talked about the discomfort that occurs under uncertainty. What he said is that people in any situation will seek for meaningful relations between variables, and if no such variable exists, discomfort occurs. Finally, my own work on the need for cognitive closure talks about the need to have closure, to have certainty, to escape uncertainty. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But actually, what is this uncertainty that we are discussing? Where does it come from? Is it coming from the external situation? For example, is it forced to us by the COVID-19 or by the economic crisis of 2008 or by the refugee crisis of 2015? Is it, in other words, objective in the environment that we need to experience it because it's out there, or is it subjective? Famous philosophers and common sense agree that objectively uncertainty is the rule, it's not the exception. So, for example, the 6th century Greek philosopher Heraclitus talked about this flux that occurs. The time is changing all the time. There is uncertainty, so that you never step in the same river twice, because it's not the same river, it's changed, and you're not the same man because you changed. Doris Day, in a famous Hitchcock movie, The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956 movie, said, the future is not ours to see. And Yogi Berra, I don't know if you know Yogi Berra, but the Americans know Yogi Berra, legendary baseball player known for his very wise script, said, prediction is tough, especially of the future. The Platters, another, probably none of you remember the Platters, but I do. In 1950, a group had a hit song called You'll Never Know. Now, on a more serious note, the philosopher of science Karl Popper talked at length about the philosophy of induction. You may have carried out thousands of observations. You may have seen thousands of swans and they were all white. That does not guarantee that the very next swan you see is going to be black. You'll never know. The tragic story of Travis Roy, a gifted American hockey player, brings this point vividly to mind. In the 11th minute of his first hockey game for Boston University, Roy Travis crashed into the boards at high speed, and he snapped his 4th and 5th cervical vertebra. And this left him paralyzed for life from that point on. Now, crashing into the boards is something that happened to hockey players all the time. Roy and most other hockey players crashed into the boards again and again and again in thousands of times over their career, and nothing happened. Yet this one time it was different, and it completely changed Roy's life from that moment on. In short, we think we know what to expect. We have driven the same route 100 times, and we expect that the 101st time is going to be the same. We had plenty of headaches, and they always go away with some paracetamol maybe. We have never fallen in the shower before, so we don't think it's going to happen. But won't it? You'll never know. So the feelings of certainty and uncertainty that we sometimes experience aren't driven by the situation, because the situation is always uncertain. These feelings are psychological. They reflect the state of our mind. They are internal, not external. They are subjective, not objective. But if uncertainty is the rule, why is it that we need certainty? Why can we not accept uncertainty as we should, rather than lulling ourselves, deceiving ourselves into false sense of certainty? And the answer is that we need certainty simply in order to live, simply in order to act. We need to know what we are doing. We need to look before we act. When we cross a busy street, we need to look and see and be certain that the road is clear. In choosing a career, a college, a spouse, we must be certain that our decision is correct. But here we face a big problem. And the problem is this: how much information do we need to gather before we are certain? There is no rule. There is no objective sign. There is no stopping rule that tells us exactly how much information, how much is enough, when enough is enough. Yet we must decide at some point. And so what are we to do? Fortunately, nature has given us a solution. And the solution is a subjective mechanism telling us what we need to do. And this subjective mechanism is what we call the need for cognitive closure. When that motivation, that need arises, we feel certain. Of course, just because we need closure does not mean that we make our decisions correctly and accurately. We may have overlooked some important bit of information and reached a completely wrong conclusion. But without certainty, we would be in limbo. We will be paralyzed, paralysis by analysis. All thought, no action. And we must act because life is action. Now, because of various reasons, genetics, our culture, our life history, people differ in how much do they need closure, do they need certainty. How much do you need closure? If you are interested in that question, there is a scale that we have developed and has been translated into numerous languages, including Polish, and has been used extensively by our colleagues at the Jagiellonian University in the laboratory of Professor Małgorzata Kosowska and other places, so you can administer it to yourself and find out how much you actually need closure. And of course, there are some situations where you need closure more than in other situations. You need closure when there's time pressure, you need to act. You need closure when information gathering is very difficult because of noise or because you're tired. So your need for closure varies from situations to situation. Now, forming judgments under need for closure has many consequences. Are these good consequences or bad consequences? That depends on who you ask. The Nazi-era German psychologist Erich Jensch considered people with high need for closure as the healthy people, that people who are very rigid opinions, very confident way of thinking, very certain of themselves, as the right kind of mental health. And people who are flexible, who are not sure about their opinion, who are open-minded, as a sign of mental pathology. Years later, people adopted the opposite opinion. Theodor Adorno viewed people who are with rigid opinion as mentally sick, as having had a history of conflict in their family that made them rigid and inflexible, and they view flexibility as the sign of mental health. But whether you like need for closure, you like people to be certain and rigid and confident, or whether you think that people should be flexible and open-minded, whether one or the other, the fact is that making decisions under high need for closure has many interesting consequences. One consequence is that when you are under high need for closure, you jump to conclusions. You make your decisions very quickly. And one aspect of it is what we call primacy effect in impression formation. In other words, when you meet somebody and you see some behaviors or some characteristics that are good or bad, you form impression immediately without investigating any further. So for example, in a study that we do, we present people with high or low need for closure with characteristics of the person. Say the first 5 characteristics are positive: he's intelligent, he's generous, he's sociable, and so on and so forth. And the subsequent 5 characteristics are negative. He's egoistic, he's aggressive, he's all kinds of things. People, and in the other experimental condition, the negative characteristics come first, followed by the positive characteristics. People under high need for closure disregard what comes later. They form their impressions primarily on the basis of the first characteristics, and they disregard the subsequent characteristics. So if the positive characteristics came first, they form a positive impression of the person, and the other characteristics do not influence them much. If the negative characteristic came first, then they form a negative impression. Another interesting characteristics of making judgments under need for cognitive closure is the reliance on stereotypes. Stereotypes are characteristics of general category, and you infer the characteristic of a person just from category membership, of whether they are women or men, the idea that professors are absent-minded, the idea that Mid-Eastern people or African Americans are aggressive. All these are stereotypes. And of course, stereotypes have very bad characteristics, bad social consequences. They lead to conflict, they lead to friction. But people under high need for closure, because they want to escape the uncertainty, they do not want to investigate the person very deeply. They do not dig very deeply. they base their characteristics on the category membership. So in one experiment, we carried out several studies on these characteristics. In one experiment that we carried out in Israel, we used the stereotype of Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. Ashkenazi Jews Ashkenazi Jews have a positive stereotype. Ashkenazi Jews come from Europe, and they are considered to be intelligent, smart, educated, and so forth. Sephardic Jews come from the Middle East, and they suffer from a negative stereotype. So what we did was presented students at the teacher's seminary with a composition. And the only thing that it was this, everybody got the same composition. What varied was the name of the author. In the one case, it was a very Ashkenazi name, Blumenthal. Doesn't get any more Ashkenazi than that. And in the other case, it was Abutbul, which is a Moroccan name. And all they had to do is to grade that composition. And what we found is the same composition was graded 15 grade points lower when it was a Moroccan name versus the Ashkenazi name. So again, by people under high need for closure, not by people under low need for closure. Now, we get certainty, we get certainty from the consensus of our group. We are social beings, so our opinions are anchored, are embedded in the opinions of people in our in-group, in our culture. And I think that creates problem, for example, when people immigrate to a different culture, all of a sudden they're exposed to a different ways, different worldview, different ways of seeing things, and that creates an uncertainty and confusion. So we looked at how people with high and low need for closure react to immigration, to how quickly they assimilate to the new culture. And we investigated Polish immigrants to Italy. And we looked at Polish immigrants who came alone or who came in a company of other Poles. And we looked at their need for cognitive closure. What we found is that people who come alone when they have high need for closure, they assimilate very quickly to the Italian culture because the only reality that they see is the Italian reality. So they quickly learn the Italian language, they quickly learn the regions of Italy, the Italian celebrities in sport, entertainment, and so forth. But Polish immigrants who come with other people from the old country, other co-ethnics, other Poles, the higher the need for closure, the less they tend to learn the ways of the new country because they have their shared reality represented by other co-ethnics, other Poles. So, this need for closure, this personal characteristic has a variety of consequences, both on the individual level, how you think, you jump to conclusions, you exhibit primacy effects, but also you're using stereotype people, and also how you adjust to a new culture. And finally, recently, the work in the Kosowska laboratory looked at another very interesting phenomenon, conspiracy theories. You know that conspiracy theories are now very proliferating in the environment. David Icke, the British conspiracy theorist, talks about reptiles who are taking over the world, and millions of people are attending his lectures. There has been recently a conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton and Democrats have a pedophile ring, and they exploit little children. And most recently, there's been the Russian conspiracy theories about weaponized mosquitoes, that the West and the Ukrainians are equipping mosquitoes with bacteria, and these mosquitoes are sent on the Russian people in order to attack them and make them sick. Małgorzata Kosowska and her colleagues carried out an experiment in Poland about a conspiracy theory that the refugees that come to Poland are financed by the European Union in order to create chaos in Poland and controlled Poland by the European Union. And she presented that theory to all kinds of people and measured the need for cognitive closure. Those people who had high need for cognitive closure tended to believe in that theory more than people with low need for cognitive closure. Now, until recently, everybody has been emphasizing the negative aspect of uncertainty, escaping uncertainty, through need for closure, fearing uncertainty, through heuristics and so forth. But is uncertainty upsetting as such? Is it uncertainty that is upsetting us? And if you think about it deeply, the answer must be no, it cannot be the case. It's not the uncertainty itself, because some people respond to the same uncertainty more positively than other people. And also, we respond to some uncertainties with greater anxiety, greater fear than we respond to other uncertainties. So what is it about some uncertainties that are so fear-evoking, so anxiety-evoking, and others are not? Think about the COVID type of uncertainty. The COVID is uncertain, but there are several things that are associated with the COVID which are in and of themselves very negative. The possibility of dying, the possibility of economic disaster that can happen to you, of being evicted from your home. So maybe it's not the uncertainty itself that is bothering you, maybe it is the consequences that are associated to the uncertainty that are bothersome. Other uncertainties may not be as bad. And there can be, in fact, exciting uncertainties. A trip to a new country, the birth of a new baby, meeting somebody new and exciting, the possibility of a new job. These are all uncertainties, but they are responded to positively because you associated with them, with those uncertainty, possible events, possible positive outcomes. So uncertainty is not as such frightening. It's not the fear of the unknown, it's the consequences that are attached to the uncertainty. It's like a Rorschach inkblot on which you project your own demons that make you fear uncertainty. Some people have demons that they project onto uncertainty, and some uncertainties have culturally a lot of negative things associated with them, but not all uncertainties. And other people project their angels, their optimism to uncertainty. Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff for the Barack Obama administration, used to say, "Let no crisis go to waste." And we can therefore say, let no uncertainty go to waste. Each uncertainty can have potentialities, can have a silver lining, can have something good that we can explore and then we can exploit and we can develop. Even the COVID-19 pandemic promoted some interesting possibilities, like doing things by Zoom, doing things remotely, that allows people from across oceans to interact very easily. Each uncertainty can be exploited to yield its positive aspects. In a recent set of study, Ewa Szumowska, Dr. Ewa Szumowska of Jagiellonian universities, the study was carried out during the COVID-19 pandemic. She asked people, some participants, to think of the things that they could accomplish under the restrictions of the pandemic. And she asked another group of participants to think of things that they had to sacrifice because of the pandemic. So some people were focusing on the positive side, what they can accomplish, and other people on things that they have to sacrifice. So what you could accomplish, some people said, you can focus on your family, you can walk in nature, you can concentrate on your work, you can watch Netflix, whatever. And other people thought of the things that you must give up, being with your friends, traveling, and so forth. And there was also a control group in which people didn't focus on anything in particular. The interesting finding was that those people who focus on the positive aspects, goals that they could accomplish, felt more free, they were in a better mood, they were more accepting of the restrictions, and they reported being more willing to comply with the restrictions. Then, whereas people who focus on the things that they had to sacrifice because of the pandemic, they felt less free, they felt more negative about the restrictions, and they intended less to comply with the restrictions than people in the control group. So it's all in your mind. There is a song by Johnny Mercer, a very old song, that says, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't focus on Mr. In-Between. And there is a lot of wisdom, and I think the research by Dr. Szumowska illustrates that focusing on the positive has positive consequences. Now, in the research that I just described by Dr. Szumowska, people were asked to specifically focus on goals that they can accomplish and goals that they cannot accomplish. But some people naturally focus on goals that they can accomplish or on the positive aspects of an uncertain situation, and other people focus on the negative aspects of uncertain situations. What can determine whether you focus on the positive or on the negative things? One thing that we looked at was a lifelong history of outcomes. People who remember their childhood as being a tough childhood, childhood where they are abandoned, or they were abused, or they were orphaned, or they had a very, very tough time, they tend to be pessimistic. They tend to have high need for closure. They have to be pessimistic. When they are faced with an uncertain situation, they tend to project their demons on the situation. They feel negative about the situation. People who feel loved when they were children, who feel that they had a positive childhood, when they were accepted, respected, encouraged, they are optimistic. They are flexible. When they see an uncertain situation, they project on it their optimism, and they see the silver lining of the positive situation. So that's one thing that makes people optimistic and pessimistic. Now, does that mean that we are forever doomed by our childhood history? No, it does not. Because what happened to us recently, recent outcomes, also determine our optimism and pessimism. So for example, if something positive happened to you, you assume that the next thing is also going to be positive. If you beat your partner in a tennis game, something that happens to me sometime, you feel that the meeting with the boss will go well, that your article will be accepted for publication, and that your marriage proposal will be accepted if you're about to make a marriage proposal. If something bad happened, if you are beaten by your partner, you think that everything is going downhill and everything is going to be bad. Of course, the recent outcomes, the effect of the recent outcomes does not last very long. And after a while, after a day or two, you go back to your baseline, to your long-term history of outcomes, to your lifelong history of outcomes. But of course, the more positive outcomes you obtain, the more your life history is determined by positive outcomes. So over time, even if you're pessimistic to begin with, you can overcome it by recent outcomes, accumulation of positive outcomes that happen to you. Now, again, do you have to be at the mercy of events of positive and negative outcomes? What if they don't happen to you? Fortunately, psychology has devised ways of making you optimistic. There's been recent development in psychology, just the 21st century development in psychology called positive psychology, and the pioneers in positive psychology devised ways of making you optimistic. There is work by Martin Seligman on learned optimism. There's work by Carol Dweck by growth mindset. Again, if you develop a growth mindset, you are less impacted by negative outcomes. You're optimistic that you can learn, that you can improve, that things are not doomed by your current failures. There's work by Angela Duckworth on grit. In other words, you are not doomed by your history, and you are not in waiting for good things to happen to you. Psychology devised ways for you to learn to be optimistic, to develop your character in a way that sees the silver lining, that accentuates the positive, eliminates the negative. So, in conclusion, uncertainty is unavoidable. And indeed, the future is not ours to see. But we need certainty in order to act, and therefore we form certainties, we form theories, we form paradigms, we create structures. But life is changed, and these structures that we have, whether they be scientific theories, our own preconceptions, our own stereotypes, they can meet with contradictions. Uncertainty can happen again and again. Some people in those circumstances escape uncertainty, like the theologians and the scientists of Copernicus era who escaped the uncertainty they introduced by simply avoiding and banning his book. Other people, however, unfortunately for us, that happened to Copernicus as well, are willing to explore the possibilities that are entailed, that are contained in the uncertainty. The trick, of course, for you personally, for me personally, for every one of us, is to know when to close your mind, when you need to have the certainty in order to act, and when to be flexible, be open-minded. And I think that the first step in that direction is to realize, to self-reflect about your own reactions to uncertainty. How do you feel about uncertainty, and how can you adjust it in order to function more optimally? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. May I ask for the mobile mic for questions? I think we have some time for questions. I'll grab it and then I'll go around the room. Thanks a lot. All right, so time for questions. Right.
Well, what about your uncertainty now? Is it positive about my question or negative?
Always positive.
That gives us a lot of information about your lifelong outcomes then. Thank you for this lecture. I think that we all could know something about our relations with other people. For me, it was very insightful. And I think that it sometimes might change also my thinking about people that tend to be negative. Because, come on, it is not always their fault, or they like. It's not their fault, as you said. It can be their lifelong outcomes. So it gave me another point of view. So I will thank you for that.
Thank you. I have a question about uncertainty in the pandemic. Are you aware of any recent research exploring the way people during the pandemic deal with uncertainty, and is it, in line with what we know now about people's reactions in uncertain times and different crises? Because I think COVID is a great example of such a crisis on a global scale. So I wonder if there has been any changes in the way people see other people, especially stereotyped groups, during this period, before and after the outbreak, or during the outbreak, compared to the time before the pandemic.
Yes, well, different people reacted to the pandemic differently depending on the outcomes that happened to them. So, people who are lower economic strata, people who are more vulnerable, older people, reacted more severely, more negatively than people who are younger, who are employed. And many people discovered during the COVID new possibilities. There has been a change in the work habits of people. People left the offices, they explored the possibility of working from home, and things never returned to the way they were before the pandemic. With respect to what happened during the pandemic in terms of relations to other people, it was a very vulnerable time for all kinds of conflicts to be exploited. So all kinds of conspiracy theories were used to inflict negative, to develop negative attitudes toward minority groups. For example, the idea that it's the Chinese who promoted the virus, that it's the immigrants, that it's the Jews, the Israelis that created the whole thing. So, given that uncertainty, a lot of people use that opportunity to associate negative aspects to the uncertainty. Again, so it was not the uncertainty as such, but what people made of it. Some people discovered wonderful things. There was an owner of restaurants in Washington, D.C., my hometown, that provided food to people who were in ships and in disaster areas. And he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for his humanitarian actions in the uncertainty. So people used it in a variety of different ways. But unfortunately, that uncertainty created an opening for people with hateful attitudes toward others to develop conspiracy theories and to promote radicalization and extremism.
A question from the back of the room over here.
Hello. So in the past, during the technological, during the technological progress, there were various movements such as Luddites or Luddites, and there were anti-progress, demolishing new factories and just movements against progress. And nowadays, I believe we feel that the times are accelerating each day. And this acceleration is bringing a lot of, indeed, uncertainty to people. In the recent months, the example was this artificial intelligence tool called ChatGPT that most of the people heard of already. And this tool accelerated or amplified the speed of work and posed threats to jobs of many people. So the modern times we see that require a lot of adaptability, and adaptability means no certainty because well, that's kind of opposite. So do you see any solution? What's the way to not go crazy in the modern, ultra-competitive and yet accelerating times? Thank you.
You are very right in talking about the intimate relation between progress and uncertainty, change and uncertainty. And I think the problem is that it's very easy to exploit it, to use it in order to increase people's fears, to develop, to cultivate people's fears. And this is, you know, the uncertainty that has to do with immigration, the uncertainty that has to do with progress, the globalization. Every event that introduces uncertainty can be used to emphasize the negative aspects. What we must do is to understand that this is not inevitable and find ways in order to promote the positive thinking about uncertainty. Whether I don't have any ready-made solutions, but I think the general principles is to prepare people that under uncertain times there can be new possibilities, there can be ways of dealing with uncertainty, and society too has to be prepared to allow people access to new opportunities, because progress will happen, technology is marching on, but the danger of politicians and others to exploit it in order to introduce fears and introduce autocratic regimes and reduce freedom and democracy is very tempting, and that has to be counteracted by allowing people to live with uncertainty, training people to live with uncertainty, to live with diversity, to understand that uncertainty is not necessarily bad. I think, you know, that's the only way. I have no specific solutions, but understanding what uncertainty is all about is the first step in that direction.
Hello. Excuse me, I'm not professional in that area, but my question was regarding that positive psychology, the point that you finished your presentation. Is there a simple link between my high need to closure and the positive psychology conclusions? I mean, is it a link that I should work out in me to be more open-minded and not to have such a big need for closure? And is there a link between this and my positive thinking. I mean, if these conclusions that come from positive psychology achievements that you mentioned are the conclusions that someone has to work out a way not to have such a high need to closure. Is there a way that I can work it out? I can, with time, I can have less need for closure. I can get more open-minded. I can become the person that doesn't have to act rapidly. Is it a way to work it out? Is it something that I can change over time? I can change my attitude? Or this is determined, that I cannot change? It's how it comes.
That's a very good question, and I think the answer is yes. Positive psychology emphasizes the benefits of thinking positively. And that means not being afraid, not being so averse to failure. Rather than fearing failure, for example, seeing failure as an opportunity to learn, thinking about things optimistically, accentuating the positive. And the more you accentuate the positive, the less you're afraid of uncertainty and the lesser you need for cognitive closure. So yes, there is a very intimate relation between positive psychology and lowering of the need for closure. It's interesting that psychology, until the year 2000, was primarily negative. In other words, psychology emphasized the negative sides of human nature, the depression, the anxiety. Psychology derived from psychiatry. Psychiatry is a medical branch of medicine, and medicine talks about illness rather than health. And psychology was therefore negative. Freud was very negative, afraid of stimulation. And psychology emphasizes all of these negative aspects and defense mechanism, defending against some bad things that can happen to you. From the year 2000 on, psychology discovered human strengths, and it's the same way as positive health movement in medicine and in the health professions has emphasized prevention rather than treatment. In psychology as well, there has been a similar movement, and yes, in fact, it counteracts this need for closure, the need for certainty, and allows people to operate in a changing environment to a better extent. And especially now, with the acceleration of change, with the great technological advances that make the world a flat place where you meet diversity of people, immigration is huge, refugees are all over. It's very important for people to live, to learn with differences, learn to live with diversity, learn to live with uncertainty.
All right, I believe we have time for one more short question.
Short question. So basically, we are not very good at judging risks and judging probabilities, right? And some people can do it very well. See, for example, the super forecasters from Philip Tetlock, right? It's a skill. We can learn it. Is there any data that shows how this ability to judge the uncertainty, like more in just vague terms, that influences our need for closure, etc., all the other stuff?
I think you can judge risks, you can predict things if you have a good theory. If the theory works, then you can make judgments based on the theory. But no theory is guaranteed to work. And even the best forecasters in Tetlock's research and others can make very bad mistakes. And there have been research that shows that even his best forecasters can be very, very wrong. So, if you happen to have a theory that works within a context, your predictions will be okay. But if something changes, then the theory might not apply. And the uncertainty, the objective uncertainty is still there. There's no such theory that can overcome that fact. You never know, in other words.
You never know.
You never know.
Once again, thank you so much for an excellent lecture. Please join me in thanking Professor Kruglanski. Thanks also to you for the questions. We are reconvening 8:30 for a discussion on closely related topics. Be with us.